There was a post recently of a photo essay about people staying at home during the COVID-19 crisis in Toronto. It was published in the magazine Canadian Art, and the critic and curator Earl Miller put up a post on Facebook saying, quote, "I am trying to figure out why these are anything more than timely snapshots," end of quote. And he linked to the article. Now, there was a very, very passionate and lengthy thread that followed. And I'm going to read some of the initial replies. I may go back to this issue a little bit later, but I'm going to read some of the initial replies because I think that it shows very clearly that there is a lot of pent-up emotion and a lot of generally unexpressed opinion about what is going on with Canadian art, that's on capitalized A, and also Canadian Art, capitalized A, the magazine. The first comment that I'm going to quote is from the artist Eldon Garnett. "Canadian art has no idea what constitutes Canadian art, lowercase. Such a shame where there are almost no art magazines remaining in Canada, with C magazine locked in writing by graduate students." And to this, another artist, Drew Simpson, replies, "This is not Canadian art magazine's fault, it's Canadian art itself. The artists in this country en masse have picked up a cancerous habit of making art with the main objective of receiving grants to perpetuate the mediocrity. Artists in Canada want mommy and daddy to cut their checks, and it's led to bad form. It's textbook-controlled opposition. Though this will make most of you shit the bed, all government funding to artists should be cancelled for a generation until they teach themselves to fish and to challenge themselves with independent practices and ideas that aren't going to end up for approval in a boardroom filled with agenda-biased art bureaucrats. The hundreds of millions of dollars saved each year can be put to something desperately needed like childhood education, infrastructure manufacturing, disability programs, and clean energy initiatives. Corporations are no different than governments, as they both have a social engineering agenda, and they, along with the developers, should fund public installations. Artists themselves should use non-partial platforms like Kickstarter and other crowdfunding sites to fund their self-righteous decorative projects, and a small percentage of the money raised should be automatically put into an art student debt relief fund to help continue the future independence of our profession." To which in turn Romas Astrauskas replied, "Drew Simpson, I have not seen a single good thing produced by funding from the government teat. I have never applied and never will." And then Drew Simpson replies to Romas, "I've never applied either. My boy Chili knows the score." And he in turn links to an article that was published at the Huffington Post, the Canadian edition of it, by Peter Jaworski, and this was published on August the 23rd, 2011. So it's around 8.5 years old. And it's entitled, "Government Grants Make Art Worse." The subtitle, "To make money as an artist in Canada, you have two choices, appeal to the crowd or appeal for a grant. The former requires strong sales, good marketing, and a solid business plan. The latter requires an ability to fill in forms." And then the article begins, "There are many Canadian books and albums that no one is ever likely to buy. Unfortunately, whether you like it or not, you've already paid for them. While the world lauds Margaret Atwood and Arcade Fire, hundreds of lesser works slip through our publishing and recording industries every year. Most never stand a chance at making it on the market, and the industry knows it. In fact, for many in the industry in Canada, it's never been about creating quality products. It's about creating any product that will pad their catalog and make them eligible for more grant money. To make money as an artist in Canada, you have two choices, appeal to the crowd or appeal for a grant. The former requires strong sales, good marketing, and a solid business plan. The latter requires an ability to fill in forms." In other words, he repeats the the quote that was used as a subtitle. If done right, the latter is more lucrative. The Canada Council for the Arts distributes approximately $180 million per year to artists, record companies, and book publishers. In addition, each province has its own arts councils, which adds over $100 million to the coffers of media publisher. The BC Arts Council, Ontario Arts Council, and Manitoba Arts Council alone do this much. By my estimation, the result is an annual arts budget in excess of $300 million in a country of only 33 million people. William Hopper, author of The Heathen's Guide to World Religions, faced the crowd grant dilemma in the book publishing business. Having started out independently printing and selling his work, he eventually secured a publishing deal to re-release the wildly popular book through normal channels. Hopper unwittingly entered the modern world of grant-oriented pulp. He tells me that the publisher, who will go unnamed, used a spell checker to quote-unquote correct the Greek, Hebrew, and Latin words used in the text. As none of these were in the dictionary, substitutions were made and promptly forgotten about. Hopper was furious. He got the rights to the book back, but not before he learned a valuable lesson. When your, quote, this is Hopper, when your primary income comes from government grants, you have no incentive to do a good job, Hopper explains. Publishers are punctilious about the requirements to get a grant, less so about the other elements of launching a successful book, like copy editing, or actually getting the product into stores. That's what happened to Lindy Voppenfjord, a Toronto-based independent musician. When his fifth solo studio album, Suspension of Disbelief, was released in 2004, Toronto's Chum FM put Beautifully Undone on high rotation. That should have garnered major sales, but Lindy's fans wrote him to tell him that they couldn't find his album in stores. In hindsight, Hopper says both he and Lindy should have expected this. Quote, it doesn't matter if it sells, Hopper says. Sales revenue is gravy. They make their money from the grants, end of quote. On the market, if you don't sell a product, you go out of business. On the government grant system, if you don't sell the product, if you don't even distribute it properly, that's not so bad. You still have the grant money to keep you going, and you move on to the next Canadian artist or author who you can use to fill out the grant application. In fact, writing grant applications has in itself become an industry, with many publishing houses paying percentages of their take to professionals who know the system. Hopper has washed his hands of Canadian publishing houses. Lindy, meanwhile, is also charting a different path. He's decided to use crowdfunding for his sixth studio album via a website, Rocket Hub, that raises money for artists, authors, etc., by getting people to pay in advance for the product and for other awards. And the article continues in that vein, a very scathing criticism of not so much the visual art scene, the galleries, but the publishing scene and the music scene in Canada. So you find that there's sort of this segue from a debate about the way Canadian visual art works to publishing and the music industry. Of those various industries, in my experience, probably the one that has the most international success, and you know, I've lived overseas for more than 17 years now, is the Canadian music industry. It really has done quite well, despite many flaws in it. And the music industry is notorious for its savagery. I mean, this is true in the United States, it's true in South Korea with the K-pop scene. Musicians really have to fight very hard to make it. But there are Canadian musicians who have made it internationally. In terms of visual arts, I'm not so sure. I think, in my personal opinion, Canada has always produced an unusually high percentage of good visual artists, especially representational artists and illustrators and so forth. But also abstract artists with sort of a refined sense of form and color, and increasingly conceptual artists and installation artists. When it comes to writing, apart from a very small percentage of, and I'm thinking here of literary fiction, apart from a very small percentage of writers who get published mainly through major publishing houses, almost nothing that gets produced in Canada reaches an international audience. Nothing from any of the small presses. Now, this is not a criticism on my part of the small presses. I know people who work at them, and you find a broad range from the most epically lazy people to people who are very committed and very passionate but operating on a shoestring. And what happens is that in reality, they get stymied at the distribution level. They don't get carried in bookstores, and the books just they die. They wither on the vine. And there's a lot of work in Canada that just doesn't, literary work that never reaches an audience outside a very tiny audience in Canada. The average literary book in Canada sells 300 copies. 300 copies. So there does need to be a debate about that. To return to the whole question of the visual art scene in Canada, I started out as a visual artist. I know something about that scene. I'm a bit out of touch with it, but I'd like to hear feedback from visual artists about how they feel the scene could be improved. And then finally, in terms of Drew Simpson's very, very strong criticism of the granting system and his call to eradicate it for a generation, I'd like to hear some discussion of that. Personally, I think that spending money on the arts is not so much a question of whether you do or don't, but how you spend the money. And so should there be changes? I know that personally, you know, I have been quite angered to find out that Heritage Canada, according to one publisher, Mark Cote, who I talked to, has sort of a rule of thumb. It's not quite an explicit rule, but a rule of thumb against publishing houses publishing Canadian citizens who are non-residents of Canada. I think that's deeply unfair. I know of at least 2 media outlets that follow that rule to the letter, and other outlets that don't follow it quite to the letter, but do use it as a rule of thumb. So there is need for reform. There's major need for discussion, and I hope that maybe this video will help inspire a bit of discussion.